So today we're covering withdrawals and refunds and the differences between the two from a FinPower Connect perspective. We'll also be covering other transactions deemed to fall under the broader classification of withdrawal to ensure most of our bases are covered. Specifically for withdrawal and refund transactions behind the scenes, the underlying functionality is the same. For instance, the refund wizard is actually just the withdrawal wizard, and it just assigns different things based on other preferences set throughout the system specifically for refunds. So we'll start off with withdrawals. Page 1 of the account withdrawal wizard. Depending on where this is launched from, you may need to search for an account or select one from the drop-down list. In the image here on the right hand side, you can see what the drop-down list and quick search options look like. If you've launched it from the action button on an account, the account details are already set for you. If you're launching it from the transactions menu instead, FinPower Connect does not already know the intended account, and therefore you must choose one manually. In the next section, we enter the details of the withdrawal transaction itself, including setting a transaction type. This is normally something like WDL, particularly if the new account wizard has been run. The new company wizard has been run and it's preset all the elements, and the client has kept it as part of their configuration. However, what will appear in this list is any transaction type that has it set as being able to be used in the withdrawal wizard and is linked to a withdrawal type element, which is likely to vary from client to client depending on their desired configuration. On page 2 of the account withdrawal wizard, we can enter the details of the external account the withdrawal is being paid out to, or the relevant disbursement account if applicable. The option to print a withdrawal advice will only appear here if you're not using disbursements. The little house button here will bring up a list of accounts already attached to the account and clients, which makes it nice and easy to select rather than having to manually key in the information. Page 3 is a page we discussed in our session on payment arrangements. This page will only appear if the account processes are up to date. This allows the user to make amendments if required to the client's regular payments, whether it be to hold the current payment value, which essentially extends the term, adjust the payment to maintain the current final payment date or maturity date, or override with a specific value. The options to adjust to maintain the current maturity date is relatively new to this wizard, having been introduced in version 3.4.4. The ability to either hold or clear the overdue balance is also available. Page 4 is the log page, and which, as is the case with other wizards we've covered in the past, will only appear if create log was ticked earlier on in the wizard. As always on this page, the user can enter any relevant notes and, if desired, an action date and time for a task to appear in the task manager for later follow-up. Once the user has finished entering the log details, Finish can be clicked, and a warning will pop up prompting the user to confirm they wish to proceed with the withdrawal. Once yes is clicked, the withdrawal will be processed and awaiting export as part of the client's normal banking processes. Depending on the payment method used, this can, however, differ. For example, a direct credit going to a borrower or investor's bank account will likely be exported under the Export Bank Transactions function, which creates a file for the client to import into their banking environment, saving a lot of time entering transactions. If the method is Zepto, however, it is processed instantly via an API integration. It is likely there will be more services like Zepto as banking and the finance industry in general progresses towards utilising the newer technology for transferring funds and things in the future. More information on the banking side of this process is available in our bank account session on YouTube, the Elements and Transactions type session, and for Zepto specifically, it has its own user guide for the API integration, which is accessible on the Intersoft website and shown here, and will be available via a link in the description. Also, after clicking Finish, the withdrawal advice will also be produced if set to do so. The sample withdrawal advice looks like this. And as always, the sample document can be used as a base for the client to build on should they wish to do so, or can define their own document in the account type settings for this event. I say this every time, but it's important that the responsibility rests with the lender to ensure that the document being produced is fit for purpose and in line with any legislative requirements for the country they're operating in. After the withdrawal has been processed, you'll see a record of it reflected in various places, such as the events block on the key details page if the client has this enabled, and a mention of the payment arrangement will also appear here if the option was utilised. Obviously, withdrawals will also appear on the transactions page where you can also access the full bank transaction information. The image showing at the moment you may not be able to see super clearly because there's a lot in here. However, it's just a visual guide to show you where you can look in FinPower Connect for the information. Additionally, if a log was created, that will of course also be available on the logs page of the account form. Before we move on to the refund wizard, I also wanted to touch on a change made in the recent 3.4.4 release. For investments, also known as deposit accounts, there is the ability to manually override the allocation of the withdrawal or refund values. The manual allocation checkbox will be available on deposit class accounts only, provided the elements are not set up to disperse. This will then allow the user to allocate the withdrawal or refund value accordingly across the 5 different balance classifications as required. Moving on to the account refund wizard, you'll see it's pretty much exactly the same except for the word refund up the very top as mentioned, and uses the same functionality behind the scenes. This wizard will, however, of course, return elements of a refund underlying type. Page 2 is the same again, with the option to produce a refund advice document instead of a withdrawal advice. Again, the payment arrangement options are available, as is the ability to create a log, and finalising is the same with just an adjusted alert confirming they wish to proceed with the refund. Account transfers. Another kind of withdrawal within the system is an account transfer. This is a withdrawal in credit to accounts internally, meaning to account records within FinPower Connect. This is accessed from the transfer action button or an account or via the transaction menu. The first page of the wizard is again very similar to the withdrawal and refund wizards, except in this case we are selecting an account record within FinPower Connect as the destination for the funds being withdrawn via transfer. Another thing to be aware of is the due immediately setting. If ticked, this will impact the overdue balance, which may be desired but also may not be. So depending on the reason for the transaction or the client's configuration, you can see here if you click the schedule button how the transfer will impact the account the funds are being transferred from. In this case, the transaction type is linked to an element configured to make the transaction due immediately, and we can see this impacting the balance overdue. This is the setting I was talking about here. You could have more than one element and transaction type, for example, if the client requires both options, transfer and transfer OD, to differentiate between which one will impact the overdue balance and which will not. The next page of the account transfer wizard allows the entry of references and notes for the transaction for both the sending account and the receiving account. The top section, labelled Specify the transfer from transaction details, is for the sending account. In other words, the account the funds are being transferred from. The bottom section is for the account receiving the funds. So the account the funds are being transferred to. This wizard is straightforward to follow, but there are tooltips available as always to assist the wizard in this, to assist the user, not the wizard. In this wizard, the tooltips give a tip that you can right-click in these fields to enter a smart tag. These particular smart tags that are available of account ID to and account ID from will automatically resolve with the account IDs once the transaction is processed, and is a handy way to see later on the account transactions page where those funds went, or conversely where they came from. Nope, too far. Next, as with the other two already covered, if Create Log was selected on our first page, the log entry page will appear for the user to enter the details if required. And finally, on clicking Finish, the alert appears as expected and the transfer is complete. Once it's complete, you can review the details on the transactions page as expected, where we can see the reference set, the notes, and in the summary for the transaction, we can see a system message also confirming where the transfer went to, and we can see the transfer increased the overdue and contractual balances. In addition to account transfers, there's also something called payment transfers. Now, these are different to your standard account transfer because they facilitate the transferring of an existing payment transaction from one account to another. To access this wizard, you need to be on the transactions page on the sending account. In other words, the account containing the payment that needs to be transferred. This function is often used if a payment has been allocated to the wrong loan for a client, if they have multiple, as an example. You simply select the transaction needing to be transferred as shown in the image here, and then click the Payment Transfer button below the grid to launch the wizard. The first page again shows the original transaction details, and then we move on to selecting the account the transfer is to go to. The same lookup facilities are available if quick search find in the drop-down list. What is available here in this section does, however, depend on other settings as well. You can also set the reference and notes on this page. Once the user is ready, they can click the Finish button, where an alert pops up prompting the user to confirm they wish to proceed. On the account, after the payment transfer, the account will display the details on both the original transaction, the original payment and the transfer as pictured here. The original transaction notes that it has been reversed, and the transfer transaction holds the details of where the payment was transferred to, as well as the reversal information for the original bank transaction. Just a quick note on reversals. Whilst you could reverse withdrawals in the past, you could not previously reverse refund transactions until version 3.4.2. Reversing withdrawals and refunds should always be completed with caution, and it is best used if the transaction is effectively being cancelled and has not already been processed externally. In other words, outside of FinPower Connect in a client's banking. If the transaction has been exported, a warning will pop up, prompting the user to check or confirm whether or not the transaction has been processed or sent externally. If this is the case, a separate entry would be a better approach, particularly for accounting purposes and the impact on the balance. It is important to note that if these particular types of bank transactions are reversed, they will not appear on statements, which differs to the likes of dishonoured payments as an example. Again, this is because FinPower Connect is treating these withdrawals as effectively cancelled and never processed outside of FinPower Connect as a real-world transaction. If you're reversing a payment transfer, however, which is what is actually pictured here, this will still appear on a statement and it does not automatically update on the corresponding account. So the reversal needs to be actioned from the account that received the incoming transfer, and you can reuse the reverse function from there. But for the original account, if you need the funds to go back to that account, for example, if it was incorrectly transferred in the first place, a manual adjustment will need to be made. Related settings. So covering off some of the specific settings for account types in this area, we'll start with some more special account documents. So as you can see in the image here, like with restructures and payment arrangements, withdrawals and refunds have their own designated event for documents to be defined. There is the sample account withdrawal advice that I mentioned earlier, which can be built on and customized, or a client can define their own customized document for these purposes. More information can be found in our documents section or session on how to get started with document customizations and what guides are available, and of course our online help section. As always, the responsibility does rest with the client to ensure whatever document they're using is fit for purpose and meets any relevant legislative requirements. On the other page, we have the setting to allow withdrawals, etc. on accounts of this type. Next, on the other page, there is a setting that says transfers must include a common client. This will restrict what accounts are available for selection by the user when they are completing a transfer. A very useful setting and one to be aware of. So it's what I was hinting at earlier. If you click the drop-down list in the search and etc. with this one ticked, it will only return a reduced amount of results. The following setting is specific to deposit account types, and depending on whether it is ticked or unticked, controls whether or not an account of this account type can be taken into a negative balance by a withdrawal or transfer. The element and transaction types cover off the following. So the element that I mentioned, as I mentioned earlier, has an underlying type that must be withdrawal. It's not pictured here, but we covered earlier. Is the setting we also mentioned earlier for is the payment due immediately when we were reviewing transfers. I just wanted to note that this also applies to withdrawals and refunds. The transaction type must be linked to an element of that type and has further settings, including whether or not the element can be used in the withdrawal wizard, whether or not the document is ticked on by default for the wizard to produce the withdrawal advice, and what account types this particular transaction type is available to. Same for refunds. They have an underlying type of refund, and as mentioned earlier, the due immediately setting is available, and default allocations, etc. The transaction type must be linked to an element of the refund type and has further settings such as whether it can be used in the account refund wizard and whether or not the print receipt or advice option is checked on by default, and the account type that this transaction type is available to. Related permissions. So as we've probably mentioned before, there is a session already on YouTube dedicated to permissions and things, but as there's some fairly new permissions that have been added in this area, we wanted to briefly touch on it. There are many permissions available for refunds, transfers and withdrawals, as you can see in the image here. Some of the newer ones include the auto send permissions for services like Zepto and the new banking interface, which will allow or deny one of these transactions to be sent immediately. Also recently added were permissions to cover the allowing or denying of a user's ability to use the manual allocation function for withdrawals and refunds. It's a good idea to check the permissions area whenever you become aware of a new setting or function to keep up to date with what is available. Lastly, moving on to a couple of common errors and alerts. we just wanted to cover off some common things that you may run into with withdrawals and refunds. The first warning showing here we saw in our last application support training, but as a refresher is related to attempting a withdrawal on an account that has been restructured using a date prior to the restructure date. As mentioned in the restructure section, you're no longer able to backdate any transactions prior to the restructure date. When completing a payment transfer, where the payment you're transferring has not yet passed the clearing stage the client has set, for example, this may be 3 days, a warning will appear to alert the user. It's important to note they are able to proceed with the transfer, but the uncleared status will be removed and will effectively be treated as cleared funds from then on. This could cause a bit of a headache and cleanup should the payment subsequently dishonour, especially considering the payment transfer is already technically reversing the original bank transaction. As we mentioned in the settings section, there is an option to allow or deny a withdrawal or transfer to take a deposit account into a negative balance. If the option allow is not ticked, if the allow option is not ticked, a user attempting to process a transaction that would take the account into a negative balance, like in our example shown here, a warning will appear advising that a withdrawal that takes the deposit account into negative is not allowed and the user will not be able to process it further. This one's a bit of a funny one, but we wanted to include it as it may pop up from time to time in testing scenarios. If there's a script involved that removes all transactions and not just those in a bank batch. This unhandled exception may occur when attempting to generate a withdrawal or refund and other payment-related processes after the above-mentioned script has been run in versions prior to 3.4.0. You might be thinking, well, this can't be a common scenario, and perhaps that's true, but this article does contain a code snippet which aligns with the best practices for coding in and around this area, which will be useful to some of you. Plus, I wanted to sneaky highlight the value again of the knowledge base while we're at it. If you search for some of the keywords in the area you've been presented with both in Power Connect, you're likely to find a knowledge base article for it, particularly if the error is an unhandled exception and the underlying cause has already been fixed in a newer version. If one isn't found, it may be something new or caused by running things in an unusual or different way and potentially because of an environmental cause. In any case, if you come across an error that you can't locate on the knowledge base, please do email application support with a copy of the error, screenshots if possible, and steps taken prior to the error occurring so that we can investigate further. We may be able to provide a workaround, advice, and can add a job if necessary for development to review and correct Power Connect's behaviour if required. So it's important that you do let us know. Come to the end of our session for today, but if there's any additional information you seek, don't hesitate to contact the application support team for user interface queries or code support in relation to code-specific questions. Next week, we'll be covering current versus contractual overdues.